folks. We're going to begin. My name is Carl Buckholt. I'm the chair of Manchester's Energy Committee. And first off, I just want to thank each and every one of you for coming here. I know we're all busy, so many things to do. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here in person. And I want to thank GNAT for filming this for those of you who can't make it. And hopefully we'll also be able to put this presentation on the Energy Committee's website. So it'll be a resource for the community. And of course, I want to thank the library. It's really hard for me to believe it's only been here 10 years. It feels like it's been forever. But they have been phenomenal. And please remember to support them next March when they ask for your budget approval. So tonight, aside from being a little nervous, I'm really happy to welcome Debbie New and Jared Rodriguez, two experts, and I don't use that word lightly, in the field that we know very little about, these thermal energy networks. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I'm curious how folks heard about this. So just sort of show of hands. Who read about it in a paper, either the guide or the journal? Okay, actually let me ask, how about which is the guide? And how about the journal? Okay. How many got an email? And you read it that way. Okay. Facebook? Anybody? Facebook. And what are we leaving out?
I was threatened by the host.
How many were personally invited by me? And it's a small town, I love it. Oh, Front Porch Forum, who saw it on that? Really?
It was my mom, it wasn't me. She
Okay.
saw it and told me about it.
Thanks. Okay, housekeeping, I think most of you know the bathrooms are out in the hall, you walk right by them on your way here. And cell phones, you know the drill. So I'm going to just give the mic over to Debbie New and let her introduce herself.
Thank you. Like Carl, I'm so glad to see so many of you here. My name is Debbie New, and I grew up in the Burlington area of Vermont, so that's where I'm coming from today. I also lived in Waitsfield. I am a teacher and community organizer. So I right now have an organization called Vermont Community Thermal Networks, and we are your in-state resource for all things about this topic. So we do the teaching and the advocacy and organizing community members like yourselves to explore this idea. And we need expertise, and so that's where Jared comes in, and he and I are working together across Vermont. We're separate organizations, but we are partners on this.
Great. Jared Rodriguez, Community Decarbonization Partners. So I work with municipalities, different organizations, building owners to help do strategic planning to get fossil fuels out of buildings in a way that's economic and people can get behind. And so we do this work across municipalities, and we help organize people into groups to help pursue goals that they're trying to reach in terms of reducing fossil fuel consumption. And we do that at the neighborhood scale, which we'll get into a little bit during this presentation.
Thank you. So this is what we would like to do in the next hour and a half or so. We are at the introduction stage. We're going to talk about heat and sharing heat. We asked you when you came in to share some words or phrases that you think about when you think about heat. We'll get to that in just a minute. Then we're going to talk about Manchester and what's important here, what's already happening, because we're talking about a local solution, and a thermal energy network can fit in with and support projects that are needed here. We'll talk more about that. Then we're going to have some slides about what is a thermal energy network and what's involved. And then we're going to go to the maps in the back of the room, and we're going to look for where you have heat already in your community that could be repurposed. So you'll be able to get up and go actually look at Manchester from the aerial view, and we'll identify where there's heat, where that heat could be used, is it close enough, and then we'll identify some clusters that might clusters of buildings that might be worth exploring as the beginning of a network that can share heat. And then we'll get to what's next after that. So I just want to reiterate that Vermont Community Thermal Networks is your in-state resource. This is us, this is what we do. We have a website, and there's a URL here at the bottom of this slide, but also some quarter sheets on the back table that can direct you to the website, and several fact sheets that we have on the website in case you want to take stuff with you and share it with your neighbors, etc. And this is Jared's organization, Community Decarbonization Partners, and how you can find him. So we also have several state and regional partners, and you probably recognize some of these, like Efficiency Vermont, energy committees like Earth Matters here in Manchester. And also we've got regional planning and economic development groups, and the Vermont Bond Bank, the Vermont Economic Development Authority, and Energy Action Network are some of the prime partners in terms of supporting this. We have a statewide team of people who are looking to advance this with us. So that's what's happening in Vermont. But we want to find out sort of who's in the room in terms of what brings you here, what you're interested in, what your role is in your community, and how this might apply to you and what you do. So just by a show of hands, it would be great to know, are there people in the room who are working on housing here in Manchester or the area? Okay, great. Are there people who are teachers or work in schools? Anybody in education? Thank you. And also town officials. Anybody here representing the town of Manchester? What about people who volunteer with the town, maybe on a committee or something like that? All right, good town representation in both ways. Are there people here working on arts and culture? Manchester, nice. And then anybody skiers? Any skiers in the room? Par chance? Okay, what about people who work in something related to tourism here in Manchester? Not surprising, right. Are there building or business owners in the room? Okay, some of those. Also, people who think their building or their business or a building near them might have extra heat without maybe knowing how much or where it would come from, but maybe you see steam coming out of the top of the building sometimes. Okay, what about people who are clean, think of themselves as clean energy advocates? And I'm wondering what we missed. Who is here who represents something that hasn't been named, that should be recognized? Yes?
Well drilling and geothermal drilling.
Great, thank you for being here. Yes, people who are working in this industry. Excellent. What else?
How about just homeowners?
Homeowners, yeah, how many homeowners here? Great. And what about anybody who's renting? Okay, that's important too. Anything else?
Well, an environmentalist and wanting clean air without
Okay.
particulate matter.
All right, so people who are really concerned about our environment and how clean things are, yeah, and sustainable. Great. Okay, well, that's really helpful to know what you are representing as you were here, and several hands raised for several different aspects. So would you like to take us through what we
Yeah,
heard?
sure. Sure, so we do this at the beginning of every workshop or presentation that we make to different communities, and it all actually turns out a little bit different, right? So this community says mostly that it's warm, comfortable, cozy, and there's a picture of a campfire, right? But also necessary, right? We can't live without heat. And there's only one sticky note with dollar signs and, electric. So I'm assuming that means that maybe we should be moving more toward electric and away from fossil fuels. So in other communities, all right, 70% of the sticky notes are the dollar signs. So I don't know what that says about you. But I haven't seen this. Like, it's just necessary, we have to do it. So that's unique about this community. So I don't know what to glean from that, but maybe we'll find out throughout the rest of this meeting.
Thank Thank you. And so when we talk about heat here, when we talk about thermal energy networks, we're talking about sharing it and sharing it across a neighborhood and potentially across a community, and we'll get into that. But the first thing we want to do is talk about Manchester. Can you flip that? So we have two questions for you, and this is a chance for you to talk amongst yourselves a little bit, turn to your neighbor in groups of 2 or 3, and just share with each other 2 things about Manchester. First of all, what's happening in Manchester now that you feel good about? So, sorry, we will represent that with, this is saying now that you feel good about, all right? So we'll make a category for that. And then also, what are your hopes for Manchester, for your community? In other words, thinking into the future. So we'll represent it that way up here.
Can I just make a little comment?
Yeah.
Because there's so many little towns around Manchester, like I'm not from Manchester.
Okay.
Just, and there might be other people not from Manchester.
Fair enough, thank you very much. And okay, the Greater Manchester region, this area.
Right.
Okay, so community writ large
Right.
for this area in Vermont. Thank you, that's really important. And if you need to correct or adjust anything else that we say, please chime in. So yes, it doesn't have to be exactly here, but what is happening now in your community that you feel good about? And then what are your hopes for the future? So we just want to take about 5 minutes for you to talk, and then we'll share those up here because thermal energy networks can relate to and support some of those things. So we want to know more about what's happening and what you'd like to see happen. So again, what's happening now you feel good about, and then what are your hopes for your community? In other words, what would you like to see change, or what would you like to see stay the same? All right, so just 5 minutes, and then we'll come back together. thank you. So I got a little bit of advice that we might use the term Northshire to talk about this area. Does that work for you?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, in other words, the larger region. Okay, so this is the Northshire area. What is happening here right now that you feel good about?
Community.
Yeah.
The community itself. Excellent, okay. And yes?
Education.
Education is strong here. That's lucky.
Schools are good.
The schools are good, okay. What else?
A lot of people volunteer for help other people.
Volunteerism, great, thank you.
The town's dedication to making it a better town, hence the building we're in. In
Absolutely.
a time when libraries are going down the crapper, we built this.
This is impressive, yeah. It clearly shows a commitment to the community and a care for that. Very nice. Carl?
So the town is willing to support both Energy Committee and the Housing Task Force. They're recognizing that there are problems that need to be worked on.
Okay. Low-income housing, right, so we've got support for the Energy Committee, support for the Housing Committee, and low-income housing, affordable housing in particular. That's great. What have we not mentioned yet? Okay, let's keep going and look a bit into the future. What are you hoping for your community that could be either something you'd like to see change or something that you'd actually like to see stay the same?
I would like to see low-income housing.
Okay, more low-income housing.
Anyone who wants to live here can afford to live here.
That's a nice way to put it too. Yeah, did everybody hear? Anyone who wants to live here can afford it.
Accessible.
Accessible,
Yeah.
okay. What else? Oh yeah,
I'd like to see the town more dedicated to the arts.
okay. Can you say a little bit about what that might look like?
Sure. Well, 4 or 5 years ago, I attempted an initiative to create art projects around the town, and there was very little support to do that. For instance, the park at the bottom of Center Hill, which is now just a bunch of trees and whatnot, we had a plan to really revitalize that as an art project, and we could get, I wanted to paint the side of the Northshire bookstore as a library and that kind of thing. It just got an enormous amount of pushback. So
Public art, more public art.
yeah, more public art. I mean, we have the art center, and we certainly have the Manchester Music Festival and the Comet Music Festival. But I'd like to see the town, as a town, more dedicated to turning this into an art gallery, a
Okay.
large art gallery.
Okay. I love that the idea of public art is coming up in this discussion already because the infrastructure we're going to talk about is underground and inside and invisible. And so one thing I've been thinking about is how can we make it visible? And what I'm hearing is through art, through public art. So we can get back to that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think diversification of our economy. Yes, we're a tourist predominant area, but because of that, we are very dependent on a tourist economy. And it makes it very difficult for certain folks to continue to work in this area and find great paying jobs and wanting to stay here.
Okay, so really good paying jobs here that are not necessarily dependent on tourism, because that's one thing. And you'd like to see more things across the economy that people can be involved in.
Yeah, I know you probably don't face this as much in Burlington, because I went to UVM, but the propensity is once you graduate from Burton or Long Trail, you go somewhere else. And then you might come back in 20 to 25 years.
If you can afford to live here and you can find a job, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
That pays more than the service industry.
Correct.
okay, that's a good qualification. I did live in Waitsfield, another resort town, for 17 years. And I could tell, we could all tell when our economy was doing well, the grocery store parking lot was full. And we couldn't find spaces and that was annoying, but it was still good. When the restaurants are full, that was okay, things are going okay. And when they weren't, that was worrisome.
Diversity in our population would be nice too.
Okay, thank you. Population diversity.
Some transportation options other than cars.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, including maybe public? Or other ways to get around?
There's the bus, but it would be nice if it moved around. I love it, but a little bit more.
A focus more on more walkable
right? So,
Bicyclable.
so more walkable could also relate to affordable housing and helping people live here and walk to a grocery store or something like that. Yeah. Did I see a hand over here? Maybe the last one? Okay. These are pretty great lists. I mean, look at what you just came up with. And maybe these are all parts of conversations you have at your kitchen tables or in the grocery store aisles or at the select board. So maybe some of this is regularly discussed here in the Northshire area. But there are things here that a thermal energy network could support and fit in with. You want to talk about that?
Sure. So I can't recall how long ago that streetscape improvement happened and the roundabouts went in and there's no longer traffic queuing for 6 miles, right? But I think what that shows is that the town here is capable of doing pretty complex things and in the realm of shared infrastructure. Right, I'm also aware of a plan to extend Amtrak here, which would be transformative, right, on its way up to Rutland, instead of going over from Whitehall in New York. So that would be fantastic, right? But it sounds like towns, and a lot of towns in Vermont, honestly, are capable of doing big things. It's just there's a little bit of fear and hesitancy to do it. So that doesn't mean don't do it. Right? It means explore it and find out what are the big barriers to getting that done. So public investments, we see that that's happened. This building is insane. This is like one of the nicest public libraries I've ever seen in my life. It's a really great building. So it does. It shows that there's a community here that can come together, pool resources, and get big things done as a flies around my head. And you've got the infrastructure to do it, you've got the volunteerism, you've got the community that gets together and talks and spreads the word about things. So that is needed to do this level of change, right? Neighborhood scale decarbonization is we have to physically change our buildings so that they don't use fossil fuels. And that is a prospect that is a little bit daunting, but at the same time we've done these things before. Right? Like we formed towns and municipalities to share infrastructure to get big things done. We know how to do that. And then in terms of achieving some of this, here, what infrastructure allows you to do is reduce the cost to any one individual building owner, homeowner, etc. It lets a community pool resources so that any one individual coming in doesn't have to bear the burden of everything on themselves. Right? That's what a community is. And so by pooling resources, we can achieve lower cost energy for perhaps an affordable housing developer. If you can pull part of the systems, the mechanical and heating and ventilation and cooling systems out of the building, and it becomes part of this shared resource, that means the building is cheaper to build. And if the building's cheaper to build, then the rent can be lower. Right, or the house or the building could sell for less and be more accessible to folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it, without necessarily throwing subsidies directly at the development of the building. It's finding other pools of money and resources to drive down the cost of construction. So I see, a lot of interest in, honestly, it's growth, right? And walkability and transportation. So you've got the bones of a really good community. There's a lot of parking lots, right? There's sort of open space that isn't pristine green space that could become things. I've also noticed that there's some empty retail, right? So like you're not immune to that whole trend, right? Maybe focusing an economy on retail and outlets isn't going to be a lasting solution, right? So what else can it become, and how do you support those what else's? And densification is a way to preserve open space that's untouched by development, and it improves the ability to walk. What's another way of doing like density or encouraging it is making it generally less expensive to build that way versus other ways. And so we've seen this through regional planning, where planners have identified core growth areas in communities because there's already infrastructure there, and you don't have to extend infrastructure to low-density places. You know, the economics of extending infrastructure to lower-density places are kind of tenuous. Because are you ever going to really recover that cost from a few people versus a bunch of people? So this idea that density and or targeted or strategic growth can help support a bunch of different goals, I think is really strong. It kind of serves as the basis for urban planning these days, luckily, right? Urban planning wasn't always like that. It went in a pretty dark direction for a while, but we're back to thinking about, honestly, what makes Vermont towns and villages special, and kind of piling on to that, and making what makes it special, I think, more available to other people that want to be here. So that's my take on this. It's not too different than other communities we met with, yeah.
Great, well thank you for telling us more about the North Shire area, and so we can start here and then talk about what a thermal energy network is. So I don't need to tell you that heat, especially in Vermont, is a precious resource. We all know that, we live here, we experience it. We spend a lot of time and effort and money trying to make heat and move heat and save as much of it as we possibly can. And what about cooling? We're going to need a lot more of that as our climate continues to warm, and many Vermonters don't have it. We can have local heating and cooling by using the resources we already have here in our communities. And that's what a thermal energy network does. The building block of that is a ground source heat pump, or also called a water source heat pump. And I imagine there's a range of knowledge about what this is and how it works across the room. I'm just going to go very basic to make sure we're all on the same page. And I will later talk about how it's different from an air source heat pump. Right now, I can say it's like an air source heat pump in that it compresses temperature from somewhere else. So a ground or water source heat pump receives temperature through water and pipes from outside the building, from the ground, in other words. And it compresses that into temperature, the kind of temperature that would keep you comfortable inside. We saw the word comfort up here before when we were talking about heat. We all want to be comfortable whether we have heating or cooling, depending on the time of year. So in winter, it can deliver heat to us using just whatever temperature comes through the water. In the summer, the process reverses. The heat pump, the water or ground source heat pump, removes heat from the building and sends it back outside into the ground, and that cools down the inside to where you would want it to be. And because it's a ground source heat pump and the temperature is coming through water and pipes from the ground, a lot of people call this geothermal energy. We're not talking about Iceland, we're not talking about deep, hot rocks and geysers and stuff like that. We're talking about a moderate temperature, and it's a constant temperature as well. It's what we can harness from just not very far underground, about the depth of a water well, really, is what we're drilling down to. We have a driller in the room who can tell us more about that. But the sun gets, energy from the sun gets absorbed by the earth, by the top layer of the earth. It's kind of like a solar panel and a battery. It can hold on to that heat. So in Vermont, year-round, it's about 50 degrees down there below the frost line. So we can drill down, send water through a pipe down and back up to a heat pump inside the building, in the basement. That's that magic gray box there. And we can access that heat from the ground. So these are what some water or ground source heat pumps look like. The one on the left is up in Burlington. It's up in the ceiling of a building, but it's not hidden. You can see it. And the one over here, the white box, it looks like a boiler. And the other component is plastic pipes. These are the pipes that go down into the boreholes and back up, but they can also connect buildings by going horizontally, and we're going to talk more about that. So these are durable plastic pipes of various diameters. Those are the components. So we can network these ground source, water source heat pumps. They can connect more than one building, and we can start small, just connecting a few homes or buildings with some boreholes, and over time, we can add more. So the network can grow and expand, and as it grows and expands, it becomes more accessible to more people, more efficient, and more affordable. Now, I've only talked about the temperature that comes from the ground, but there are other sources as well, and I'm going to talk about 3. The first is wastewater. I mean, think about it. We use a lot of water in our homes and buildings and businesses, and much of it we heat up first. So the temperature of the water that we're flushing, that's leaving our building, is about 70 degrees, which is maybe kind of what you want inside to be comfortable year-round. So recovering heat from wastewater is possible in the building, as it leaves the building. Also, you could tap into not a sewer line itself. You can tap into the temperature of the water in a sewer line, and also at a wastewater treatment plant, which is kind of like a gold mine of heat. There could be so much heat there that can be repurposed and sent to other buildings. Another form of heat that we can use is waste heat. And this comes largely from cooling, like in a grocery store or an ice arena. When you need to cool something, you have to reject heat. That's how your refrigerator works. So if you have a large refrigerator like an ice arena or a supermarket, you're rejecting a lot of heat. And that comes out through fans on tops of buildings or cooling towers. We don't see it, but most of the heat that we're making as we cool our buildings and ice arenas and stuff like that is going out into the air right now. And this is what it could look like in a Vermont town. So you've got the grocery store over there on the left that's contributing waste heat from the fans on top. And this is a conceptual diagram, not how it actually works. And a lot of buildings are contributing heat through their wastewater. And under the town green, it could be a parking lot as well, or a recreational field. That's where the boreholes can be drilled, and then it's covered, and you don't even know it's there. Another source of thermal energy that most people are not aware of is PV thermal, which is a lot like the idea of collecting solar energy to heat water. So the sun obviously makes electricity through solar panels, but it also makes heat. So if we put thermal coils behind the solar panel, they can remove heat from the panel, which makes the panels function more efficiently. So that is a win-win, and that captured heat can be sent into a network. It can be sent underground to reheat the ground. If you've got geothermal boreholes that are pulling heat from the ground, the solar panels can send heat back down, so there's a constant cycle of heat and heat availability. So to review, thermal energy networks use ground source heat pumps and underground pipes to connect multiple buildings, and they provide heating and cooling and hot water and also thermal storage. It's not intermittent. So this heat already exists across a community. In many cases has already been paid for and often is otherwise discarded, and it can be used efficiently. And this is part of what gets me really excited about the solution when I think about Vermont and our energy future. This is an air source heat pump. It's pulling sometimes from 0 degrees, sometimes from 90 degrees, or more or less. And that means they have to work harder. They do work. They are an important solution, and we need them in many of our buildings now. So air source heat pumps are an important solution and definitely part of the equation. But they use more electricity. A ground source heat pump, as I mentioned, is pulling from about 50 degrees, or in the case of waste heat or wastewater, it could be 70 or more. And so that kind of heat pump doesn't have to work as hard. So it uses less electricity and has a very high efficiency. And that benefits us all in many ways. There are other benefits of thermal energy networks, and there's a whole list, and this is where you come in because I gave many of you cards to help me remember all of this. So you don't have to go in order, but I do want to start with safe. Who did I give safe to? Safe is over there. Okay, so a thermal energy network, this technology, is safe because there's no risk of explosions or toxic leaks. It's water, essentially water in pipes, so it's very different from fossil fuels. What else do we have? Something over here. Clean. Okay. The heat pumps themselves, there are no emissions from the ground source heat pumps and the pipes underground. The only emissions come from whatever the electricity is that's required to run the pumps. So this is an electrification solution, but it uses less electricity. So if you're pulling your electricity from solar panels, you can get pretty close to no emissions from this system. It can dramatically cut emissions. Some of these systems are looking at 80 or 90% of a reduction in emissions when they're installed. What else do we have? Local. Okay, so the heat that we're talking about is local. It's here. We're not importing anything, so we can also keep our energy dollars here and reinvest that money in our community rather than sending it out of state or out of our country. What else? Okay, if you have something that says efficient, I'm going to get back to you. I think there's several of them. This one is healthy. So because there's nothing burned inside, there's no combustion involved, that means the indoor air is safer to breathe. When you're combusting a fossil fuel or wood, there are particulates that are released, and that is not good for our lungs or our health. But this will mean that indoor air is healthy for us. Reliable. Okay, so we have many sources of thermal energy right here. There's a diversity of sources, and there's the constant temperature of the earth. So this kind of energy can be very reliable. Accessible. It's a neighborhood scale solution. So it's not about me and my home or my business and what I can figure out or afford to do right here. It's about what can be available across a community and people can connect to it. So that means that people of various incomes and situations and just having the time to figure out what to do, it makes it easy for many more people to move off of fossil fuels. Affordable. Okay, so we're going to talk more about the upfront costs involved in shared infrastructure like this, but the bills that we are seeing from thermal energy networks, if people are moving from oil or propane, could be about 20 to 30% less than people are paying for delivered fuels. So because the systems are drawing from constant temperatures and it's coming from here, bills can be predictable. They're not going to go up and down like fossil fuel costs are, so it's going to be affordable and predictable. In fact, it could be a fixed fee that you're paying every month, so you're going to know what your energy costs are. What did I miss? Resilient. The components of this that I showed you are either inside or underground, no compressors outside and that kind of thing. So they are able to withstand interruptions, disruptions, and extreme weather much more easily. Montpelier has an underground system of pipes and delivering heat to buildings, and that did very well in the flooding, and they're looking to do more of that kind of system there. What else? Just. Okay. As in creating a just transition. The kinds of skills that are needed to maintain and install these systems are basically plumbing and pipe fitting jobs. And whether someone works on gas, as in the Vermont gas system territory of near Burlington, or they work for a delivered fuel company, like the local companies that work around here, they have the same skills that are needed. So plumbing and pipe fitting is what's needed, and they can easily transition without much training into this business and into this kind of work. So it can provide quality jobs for people in Vermont who want to keep working and keep using those same skills. Anything else that I missed? Okay, there are a lot of efficient cards out there, right? Oh, right. Efficient, yes. And there are a lot of efficient cards because of the high efficiency of these systems. So what I want to get into is going to talk about that high efficiency. And I want to focus on the energy savings and the cost savings of these systems. So we've talked about no fossil fuels and high efficiency heat pumps and using less electricity, which also means we have less demand on the electric grid. We don't have to build out as many wires and poles to take care of peak times when everybody needs electricity. We need to electrify a lot of things in order to get off fossil fuels, but we don't have to electrify everything. We can use this solution, which is much lower in terms of electricity use. And from all of this flow, various cost savings. So with no fossil fuels, we have cost stability that I mentioned earlier. With high efficiency, we have lower operational and maintenance costs and longer lasting equipment because there's less wear and tear on them. They actually just last a lot longer. And then also, the electric bill savings, we not only pay less, we use less electricity, but we also don't have to pay the high costs of building out the electric grid across Vermont and across our region. So what we're talking about is shared infrastructure, and it's much like a water or a wastewater system. And when we talk about shared infrastructure, that means that there's a certain amount of upfront cost, as there is with a thermal energy network, but it is manageable. And this is one way it could work. A third-party company could be hired, contracted with by a town, by a community, to develop, finance, construct, and operate a system for a time. So that means that the customers don't have to shoulder the upfront cost themselves. They could pay a one-time, reasonable connection fee, and then over time, they're paying regular monthly bills, which means that the third party recovers their initial investment over time and over a longer period of time. So this is what we're looking at for Vermont communities that are bond constrained and people don't want their taxes to go up. These systems can generate revenue for a town or community that can be used to pay back the system, whether it's through a third party or not. So from these energy and cost savings, if we can manage those upfront costs, we can access a lot of different community benefits. And this is a short list of what we hear from a lot of Vermont communities is important to them. So economic development is often top of the list. Attracting businesses, allowing businesses to connect easily to clean energy locally that is affordable. And downtown revitalization goes along with that. Affordable housing, Jared mentioned earlier, that if you're paying for the mechanical systems, the HVAC equipment separately, as part of an arrangement with a third party, that can lower the cost of constructing the housing and also of the rents for the people we want to have live there. And as I mentioned, they're more resilient, which in Vermont, with the flooding that we've had recently, really starts to matter, and then the quality jobs that we want to have in our communities. So at this point, we have a couple of examples for you of where this is working in Vermont and other places, and I'm going to turn it over to Jared.
Great, thanks. So really interesting project in Burlington region, Champlain College. This project started out with an individual building, new construction going in, and they chose to add geothermal to the building. They realized that that well was overproducing thermal energy, and they had the idea of maybe that extra thermal energy from the well could be shared with an additional building. So they did. So they retrofit an existing building and connected them. And so once they realized that two buildings could be connected to a single geothermal system, they kind of went crazy, and they planned for retrofitting over time the entire campus. And they're almost there. They're almost to the entire campus. And the campus is being served by multiple geothermal wells, open loop geothermal wells where water is drawn out of the ground at a certain temperature and then rejected back into the ground at another temperature. And they've decided that they were going to pursue with effectively a geothermal thermal energy network at this campus, not all at once, and that's kind of key. Here's another one. So this is a really interesting example of a really small community in Iowa. It's the county seat in West Union, Iowa, 2,500 residents. When the county courthouse building, which is shown here in the image, decided that they needed to replace their aging boiler system, someone said, well, why don't we check out geothermal? So they did, and it worked out. They ended up getting a grant for it. But then people around the community started to realize, well, you know, I have a really high cost of energy and heating energy in my building. Could I connect to your geothermal system across the street? Is this a stupid question? And the engineer said, no, it's not. It's actually a pretty smart question, because the more people you add to a system, the lower the cost is for any individual, right? Thinking about this now as shared infrastructure. And so the town said, this is something that we can support. We think from an economic development perspective, this is going to support growth in our community. It'll make us more competitive with other neighboring communities. They were struggling, they had empty storefronts, and they effectively formed an entity that was effectively leased to the people that are using this system, to the building owners that are using the system. And so the municipality owns the system, but it is operated by what is basically a business cooperative, almost like a local development corporation, right? And we can get into some of those ownership models at the end of the presentation. But the other thing that's really interesting about this project is they had a lot of goals, right? Like you all have a lot of goals here. they also had a ton of goals for revitalizing their community. They had to deal with stormwater runoff, they wanted to bury utilities, they needed to be more competitive from an economic development perspective, they wanted to be more walkable and safer for pedestrians. So they decided that they were gonna not make the project smaller, but make the project bigger in order to lay on more incentives and opportunities and additional pots of money that they could get from their state, county, and from the federal government. So as they're ripping up the sidewalks, they're replacing the sidewalks with something that's more conducive to pedestrian safety, right? They bumped out these corners here to make turning vehicles turn slower. They raised the intersection. They added additional public art and public amenities, including an amphitheater at the corner here. They've increased the amount of permeability, right? So water can absorb into the ground versus going into stormwater sewers. And by adding basically these bioswales, right, or areas where water can soak into the ground. And while doing that, they're adding this distribution pipe from the geothermal bore fields that are now located underneath the park to all the buildings that are serving the downtown and the residents. So really interesting project, and it's been operating since 2012.
So that brings us essentially back to where we started. Not only that heat is a precious resource, but that we have a lot of heat already and we have opportunities to harness it. So that brings us to the Manchester area, and this is a map, hard to read at this scale, but this is a map of the density that we see around here. We have two maps in the back of the Manchester area. One is more zoomed in and the other is this big picture. And what we would like to do is investigate where there is already heat and where it might be used, and where there could possibly be a cluster of buildings that could form the beginning of a node or the beginning of a network. So when we go back to the maps, first of all, these are your maps. You can write on them, you can draw, you can circle buildings, that kind of thing. There are pens available. But what we're looking for when we're looking for heat are some of these kinds of buildings, and I'll leave this up here for you to refer to. So I mentioned refrigeration, and those are at the top, those first three. Wastewater. Data processing centers, I don't necessarily think about those in Vermont, but I recently learned that a bank headquarters has so many servers that they have to cool that room constantly, 24/7, and they're rejecting a lot of heat. So you never know where there's a data center lurking. And that could be telephone or internet facilities as well. Breweries, distilleries, that's wastewater, and also waste heat bakeries, large office buildings. Also, and we get down to the bottom, we see ponds, reservoirs, quarries, and mines. There's water there where we could absorb the temperature. Did you know that the Nashville airport is heated and cooled from a quarry, from water in a quarry? The whole airport. And there are two airports like that in this country. So we need to think about environmental permitting in Vermont in order to use surface water, but it's an interesting idea. People are pointing at Lake Champlain and saying, what about that? And then green spaces, parking lots, rec fields, those could host geothermal bore fields, and also any existing solar arrays or places where you want to put solar. That could be an opportunity as well. So that's what we're looking for, and we just want to take a bunch of time to spend with the maps and talking with you about what's there. So choose your map, and then we'll come back together and talk about what we saw. But I'm realizing there's some hands. Maybe you have some questions. I forgot to ask about that. Yeah.
Is there a calculation for, is there heat loss as pipes going from the thermal source out to a building? Is there a ratio? Or
Yeah, really
there's
good
got to be
question.
some heat loss, right?
Yeah, really good question. So it depends on the temperature of the medium in the pipe, right? The water in the pipe. So if the water that we're circulating is always 50 or 55, and the ground is always 50 or 55, there's no heat loss. If we're circulating something a little bit higher, then maybe we want to think about insulating that pipe, right?
So that's how you counter that, you just simply insulate the pipe.
You insulate the pipe, or you reduce the length, right? These systems can be blended, right? There could be systems that are operating at that ambient temperature, we'll call it, that feed systems that operate at higher temperatures. And the way to figure out which system is needed is really dependent on what's connected. So if you have a building that needs higher temperatures, maybe there's a mix of systems serving that particular neighborhood. So there's rather flexible ways of designing these systems that cross sort of different types of technology, but they can all sort of interconnect and interact in order to optimize who's connected, but also who's supplying heat, if that makes sense.
If I could, I don't want to
Sure.
monopolize this, but do you require a certain density of buildings?
Yeah, so
It
you'll
doesn't
notice.
work like up on Wide Awake Road where we have 12 houses.
Right, so you'll notice, right, there's one thing, there's a ruler that's limited to a size radius, right? So we're wanting to look within a particular radius, right? There's also a density limitation. So you're not gonna do shared infrastructure for homes that are on 1 acre lots, right, or bigger. Wherever the sewer system goes is probably where this system will go. So keep that in mind.
Yep, okay, thank you.
Yeah, the radius that we're dealing with in the back is about 1/4 of a mile.
On the wastewater, are you only talking about temperatures of water, or are you also considering like the methane gas and you're also purposing that?
Really interesting question. So we were just in another community where the solid waste coming off of industrial waste processes, food manufacturing, wastewater treatment plant goes into a digester, right? And they process that waste and turn it into methane gas and then generate electricity, right? You might have heard of cow power. That process creates a lot of waste heat. That's one resource, right? I don't believe that that's happening anywhere here yet. So that's one resource. The other resource is literally after treatment and the water is clean and it's being discharged into whatever body of water, a creek, wherever, that temperature is typically at 55, 60 something degrees. So then you can pull that excess heat out of that too, right? And there's a lot more heat in that than there would be making methane, if that makes sense. Some treatment plants operate in a way where they are making methane. This one is not, the one here in Manchester. But this is like a complex topic, and there's a lot to talk about in there, but really good question. Yeah.
Two things. I'm wondering how far down the boreholes go, and so therefore, whatever depth that is, then the pipe is coming off those boreholes. So that's my first question, and also, how do you cross the road? So, I'm just thinking about how awful it is to drive around Manchester right now, even with the roundabouts. And it's very difficult to get from A to B if there's disruption about getting a pipe under a road. So I just wondered if you could answer that.
Right, so I'll start with that question. So when systems are being planned, you prefer to not cross the road. So if you can make a system happen that might be smaller than what it might end up being in the future, try to stay within a block, right? That's the first thing. Crossing a road is not impossible. So you could cross a road at a depth that's below the freeze thaw line, right? But then you're trenching, so you are impacting. In this other community, literally the same community that I was talking about earlier, they were getting a pipe from a cheese manufacturer to this anaerobic digester, and they actually directionally drilled for the pipe and pushed the pipe underground without having to trench. So this is probably the way that things will happen as that technology continues to be adopted. That's how we do fiber optics. That's how we do transmission now. There's a lot of really interesting technology out there for drilling. And then in terms of drilling, how deep? It's as deep as the economics will let you go, right? So there are systems that go down 2,500 feet. Most systems go down 400 feet. There's a lot of drilling that's occurring now, given new technology that goes to 800 feet. So the deeper you go, the less boreholes you need. But geothermal isn't always a deep drilled borehole, right? It could also be like a slinky underground and buried. So there's a lot of different forms of what geothermal is, but the drilling down in a borehole could be anywhere between 200 feet to 2,500 feet, or even deeper. There are others that are going much deeper than that, and they're trying to get to those hot rocks. Yeah.
Should we ask our driller if he has anything to add? We have a driller in the room. Do you want to add anything?
Typically, when you look at geothermal and depths, and low depths, usually it's 200 feet per ton. So if you know how much tonnage you need, that's how you can establish how big of a hole, or how many holes you need, as far as drilling goes. The more holes that you make, the more casing pipe. So the actual casing that separates the topsoil from the actual rock bed, the more holes you make, the more of that casing pipe that you're actually going to need. So for instance, if, let's just say as a hypothetical, it's 20 feet to rock bed, so you got your topsoil, and you might have some other fine minerals underneath it, but eventually you hit the core of the earth, the rock of the earth. If that distance from the top to the rock is 20 feet, you're gonna have to do at least 40 feet of pipe casing, because you need so much of that casing actually in the rock bed. So if you do another hole, you gotta do another 40 feet, and another 40 feet, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of variables in how many you would drill and how deep they go, but again, one of the biggest measures of that is the actual tonnage. So the actual weight of what the actual place you're going to be cooling or heating is.
Right, and if we can incorporate other thermal energy resources, right, we talked about a bunch of them, then we can reduce the number of boreholes, which can make the system more economic, if that makes sense.
On the topic of disruption, the other principle we're trying to follow in Vermont, other than start small and you don't have to do everything at once, is start early. And this is where your planning commission and other town committees are important, because if there's a road being dug up, it's less expensive and less disruptive to install pipes for thermal energy networks at the same time. So that is a whole conversation to add, but in terms of affordable housing projects and all sorts of things, start early, start planning.
Oh, yeah, there's me here. and then-
Yep.
So first is a question. That you mentioned the Montpelier project. How was that a third-party implemented system, or was it something that the municipality did themselves, or?
Yeah, Montpelier is an interesting project because it is both owned by the state and the city, and there's different parts of it, right? So it's a little bit complicated from that perspective. Hartford, Connecticut has the same thing. The other thing that's different is it's moving steam and very high temperature hot water. So there's a lot of losses in it because it's losing heat as it's being distributed. It's a lot like New York City has a steam system, and when you drive down, right, the iconic image is steam billowing from the streets. There's a lot of losses. So if we can move heat at a lower temperature, we're losing less heat. So you'll hear like pretty negative things, I think, about the Montpelier project. But there's a whole host of reasons for that, including, it was intended to grow, and there wasn't an effort to make it grow in order to make the economics better. So there's a lot of nuances to that conversation. What we're talking about is something fundamentally different than that kind of project. Yeah.
So the second part of that is, it's actually not really a question, but you actually brought up a great point, is that when we're doing infrastructure, that it's a lot easier to plan for these projects. And I think for everyone in the room, if you haven't been following, there has been a long time discussion on expanding our sewer lines to access more areas for housing in the Ridgeville Road area, and expanding the municipal sewer system. That is, at least, I wouldn't say it's not in infant stages. We're 90% through on the study of whether the feasibility. There are private folks who are interested in buying into the system to help with the cost, because it is expensive. But the whole point is also to potentially develop affordable housing solutions, right? So this could be a fantastic opportunity because it's actually also, this sewer line is right up against the wastewater treatment facility. So it is in proximity to so many sources of heat.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of laying pipe isn't really the pipe. It's the trench and all the labor. Yeah.
Yeah, so how applicable is this to residential kind of developments? Because that's really what you're talking about, the whole Green Mountain Estates area there. The houses are reasonably dense. I mean, they're not acre lots, they're smaller than that, so.
Yeah, and I think we can add the map. I will show you where the most ideal, so you could see it. Because seeing it visually, I think, is more important than me just saying some density number, right? So, like, we're talking about more inner village type areas, right? Where there might be a street grid, right? Where there might be existing sort of like historic pre-automobile type development. Yeah.
And maybe for later, so we can investigate on our own, but are there more smaller projects you're working on in Vermont besides Montpelier or say Champlain College, which is pretty, you know, it's a
Right.
campus. Right?
Yeah. So yes, some of them I don't know that we would share right now, right? Because they're, you know, folks are sensitive about information getting out. But there's a lot of communities that are very much like this one.
That are doing it now or in
That
the
are
process?
actively exploring.
Okay.
And there are a few really interesting and good examples of how a system could begin. One of them is there's a library that's about to almost triple in size. They're going to expand this library, and they've already decided that they want to do geothermal. We had a public meeting. With that team and Town Infrastructure Committee and a bunch of people. And somebody asked the question, well, you know, town office is right next door. Do you think we can connect it? And I'm like, well, what are the systems in the building? Can we go, like, understand that? And it turns out that the town office is, you know, exactly the right type of system to connect to that. So because the library was pursuing geothermal, then you already have this sort of cluster. Within that block, there are a bunch of other uses. And so now there's a reason to do more directed outreach to other building owners right nearby, because now you've got the start of a network. Yeah. So like you can plan this in broad sweeps. Like you could plan for the whole town, but know that it's not going to be all at once. It's never going to be all at once, right? It's going to be incremental, and it's going to be based on the needs of existing buildings, future planned buildings, and sometimes redevelopment. Yeah. So that's sort of what drives how this comes together and what it might look like. Yeah.
Are there any types of permits you have to get? Does the Public Utility Commission have any, you know, say about this, or?
Yeah, really good question. So I'll talk about the construction piece, and then you can talk about the regulatory piece. So any permits that are, you know, required for this, right? It kind of has to meet the same thresholds for Act 250 permits, right? So if it goes above that threshold, it's Act 250, and local building permits. And if you're crossing a right-of-way, it depends who owns that road, right? So if the town is owning the road, then you're dealing with the town. If the state's owning the road, you're dealing with the state. And God forbid you're ever trying to cross train tracks. Yeah. Still have to tell them.
Okay, so we passed a bill in the last session, so that it is now Vermont law that any municipality in Vermont that wants to own and operate a thermal energy network now can do that without any state oversight, because it's a locally governed entity. So we can go ahead and implement these. We all have the green light. There are many ways to do municipal ownership, many pathways. It doesn't mean one thing, so that's another conversation. But also cooperatives, co-ops. We have 2 electric co-ops. We have a solar co-op in Vermont. We have a lot of food co-ops. Cabot Creamery is a co-op. A cooperative could own and operate that because it's also governed locally by its members. So that fits as well. A homeowners association, same thing. I would say if it's big enough, that could work. But if you are a private company selling heat to the public, you would need to be regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. There is a study now mandated underway about what those regulations would look like. That study will be done in December of next year, and then we'll see what happens. So it's much faster right now to be a municipality or a cooperative and move a project forward. We can do that. Is there maybe one more question? And then we'll go look at the maps and more questions can be discussed as we do that. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment, we're right on rock. A lot of our communities are, the ledge is just right there. Does that make a difference if you were doing like a new build or a new community, dealing with that ledge that's just dig down, you can't even put a hole in the ground?
Okay, so what if I try the answer I've been doing and test it out with our driller and expert?
The closer the better.
Okay, so bedrock is actually really good at transferring heat. It's an asset. So being on rock is good. Sand, maybe not so much. So if you have bedrock, it might eat up more drill bits. I'm looking at our driller. But you don't have to case it. When you hit rock, you don't have to case it. When you're in soil and that kind of thing, you have to case it to protect it. He was talking about casing, and that can be expensive. So, how did I do?
That was really good, actually. That's pretty much spot on. There's one thing I would add to that. So when you start drilling through soil and dirt and clays and different types of minerals, before you actually get to the rock bed, this is where things can get really tricky. So you got to imagine a drill bit going into the ground. And what happens if you start digging a hole? Just imagine digging a hole in the ground and you're going straight down. And imagine now that if something, it starts collapsing on itself, right? It starts filling in. So you've got to stop using air pressure and switch over to a water pressure. And when you switch over to a water pressure, you usually have what they call a pit. The pit's usually 6 feet deep. You got to fill that with water. You got to change the drill bit to a mudding bit. That way it kind of cauterizes the side, and air's not escaping through pockets, the hole's not collapsing. We would change over to water pressure, which does, in fact, can get more expensive when you do that, versus just drilling with air pressure itself, if that makes sense.
So we can say thank you, Green Mountain State, we've got some good bedrock.
I mean, trenching ain't easy. Right, the ledge is right there. That's a different
That's
story.
somebody else.
So let's go look at the Manchester area. Let's look at the maps. There are two rulers that have a transparent section that represents 1/4 of a mile. They're different for each map because one is more zoomed in than the other. So you can play with not only where you can find heat, but also how far away things are that might be connectable. So we have this list up here of what you're looking for. Feel free to find your way in the map, first of all, and write in, oh, this is my house, or this is my kid's school, or this is the grocery store, or that kind of thing. So we can find our place in the map, and then we can start circling places that might have some extra heat, and places that might need it. So we'll do that, and then we'll come back together before the end of the But I just, wherever you are right now is fine. I just wanted to give Jared a chance to talk about what he sees on these maps when he looks at this community and where potential might be. And then we're gonna talk about what could be next, just for a couple minutes. Yeah, grab a chair if you want to. Or if you want to be looking at the maps with Jared, you could be around. But Jared, here, you want this?
Yeah, sure. So I said earlier, right, that
So what we do is one-to-one outreach. In other words, we meet individually with businesses, with officials, with people who might be able to help make this happen. And then when we have enough people who have said that they're interested, we consider them interested parties, and we get them together. And we're just at that point in a couple other Vermont communities where we start really honing in on the buildings, and we start asking, how do you heat? How do you cool? How old is your equipment? And we start finding out how difficult it would be for you to connect, or you, or could it come, I think I just turned it off. Yeah. Or maybe I'm out of range or out of battery. I'll just try to speak loudly. Or if we could bring it to your place eventually, and what the phases would be. So the first thing to do is form a group of people who want to explore this further, take it the next steps, and make a list with us of the people that you want to and need to talk to, and then we can help with those meetings. We would do those meetings via Zoom because Jared is in New York State. And then when we have enough people ready to get together to talk specifics and define a project, then we would come back together in person and spend maybe 2 hours really digging into what that would look like. So that's the process we're following and what you could consider, and I am always available to consult about this, and Jared can be part of it when we need his expertise. He's been showing up a lot for Vermont communities. So I'm just going to hand it to Carl to close out the evening. As I said, we can stick around a little bit more if you still have questions or you want to talk a bit more, but thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
And,
Thank you.
I have no idea what to say other than thanks for coming again, and I won't say anything else I'm going to say.
Did you get anything out of this? Like, how are you feeling at this point, walking out the door?
Well, I'm excited that there were this many people from different areas. I really appreciate your coming as a Rockville and representing the BDA. I think there's a lot of potential. You know, we got Tim Waker, who's not just a plumber, but on the housing group and development review board. We've got Thomas and John, the select board, and the planning commission. So we've got the beginning of some town officials who can really take the next step. And I'm just thrilled that you are willing